18 months after she vanished, the Korean Mafia boss received a call that shattered his carefully controlled world. "Sir, she had your child." The Seoul skyline was quiet that night. Too quiet for a man like Han Jae-min. A man who had spent his life surviving knife fights, corporate betrayals, and the kind of violence that stained a man's soul. Silence made him uneasy. Silence meant the storm was gathering. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, a glass of soju in his hand, watching the city lights blur through the night haze. The stillness outside mirrored the void inside his chest. The one he'd been carrying for 18 months. 18 months since she left. 18 months since she walked out of his life without explanation. 18 months since he forced himself to let her go. Because loving her had been the one thing a man in his position couldn't afford. Her name still burned on his tongue like whiskey and regret. Maya, 26 years old, too innocent for him, too gentle for his world, too radiant for a man whose hands were painted with blood. She had been everything he had no right to claim, and the only woman who ever made him want to be something more than what he was. Their affair had been a secret, a reckless, forbidden flame that blazed too bright to survive. And when she disappeared, leaving behind only silence, he honored it. Because he believed she deserved a life far away from the darkness that followed him like a shadow. He was wrong. The phone rang. Han didn't move at first. Calls at midnight were never innocent. Calls at midnight meant death, disappearance, or betrayal. He answered anyway. Han Jae-min. A trembling breath crackled through the line. A woman's voice, hesitant, professional, unfamiliar. "Sir, I'm calling from Seoul National University Hospital." Han's jaw tightened. His grip on the glass turned his knuckles white. "Who is this?" "My name is Dr. Park. I'm contacting you because your name was listed as the emergency contact for a patient." His heart stopped mid-beat. He never gave out his name. Never allowed anyone to list him for anything. Not unless... "Who?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. The doctor hesitated. "Maya Chin." The glass slipped from his fingers and exploded against the marble floor. For a moment, Han couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything except the rush of her name crashing through him like a tidal wave. Maya, alive, in a hospital, reaching out to him after 18 months of silence. What happened to her? His voice was barely controlled, dangerous in its restraint. "She's stable now," the doctor said quickly, nervously. But she was brought in after collapsing from severe exhaustion, malnutrition, and stress. "And she," the doctor stopped. "And she what?" Han's voice cut through the line like a blade. "She had a child with her." The world tilted. A child with her. A child she never mentioned. A child that could only be. "Sir," the doctor whispered, her voice trembling. "The little girl is healthy." But Maya, before she lost consciousness, she said something. Han's pulse hammered against his skull like war drums. She said, "Call him. Tell him it's his." Silence. Heavy. Crushing. Shattering. Han closed his eyes, and for the first time in his brutal life, he felt something that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Real fear. The kind that stripped away every layer of armor he'd built around himself. "My child," he whispered, the words foreign on his tongue. "Yes," the doctor said softly. "A daughter." The word hit him harder than any bullet, any blade, any betrayal he'd ever endured. "Where are they?" he asked, already moving, already grabbing his coat, already calculating the fastest route. "Seoul National University Hospital, private wing, room 407. "But sir..." He hung up. There was no force on earth that could stop him now. Not the rain beginning to fall, not his enemy circling in the shadows, not the 18 months of silence between them, not even Maya's reasons for leaving. He was going to her. To the woman he never stopped wanting. To the daughter he never knew existed. And God help anyone who tried to stand in his way. The drive to Seoul National University Hospital felt longer than any battle Han Jae-min had ever fought. Rain hammered against the windshield of his black Mercedes, the wipers struggling to keep pace, but he didn't ease off the accelerator. His knuckles were bone white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Maya. A child. His child. The words replayed in his mind on an endless loop, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. He had spent years building an empire in the shadows, surviving assassination attempts, territorial wars, and the constant weight of betrayal. He had buried friends, eliminated enemies, and locked away every soft part of himself that could be used as a weakness. Nothing had ever shaken him. But this had him coming undone at the seams. He pulled into the hospital parking structure, barely remembering to cut the engine before he was out of the car and striding toward the entrance. The sterile white lights were harsh, the smell of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils, but none of it registered. He went straight to the reception desk. "Maya Chin," he said, his voice low and absolute. "Room 407, private wing." The nurse looked up, startled by the intensity radiating from him, the danger barely leashed behind his eyes. "Sir, visiting hours are." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not asking for permission." Something in his tone, in the cold certainty of his gaze, made her swallow hard and nod quickly. "Fourth floor, east wing. The elevators are." He was already moving. The elevator was too slow, so he took the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the empty concrete shaft. His heart pounded with every step, not from exertion, but from something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Vulnerability. When he reached the fourth floor, he paused outside room 407. For the first time in 18 months, he hesitated. What if she didn't want him there? What if she had fled from him deliberately? What if she looked at him with fear instead of the warmth he remembered? What if the child wasn't? No. He shut that thought down with brutal efficiency. Maya would never lie about something like this. Not her. Not the woman who had trembled in his arms and whispered that she loved him even though she knew what he was. Not the woman who had disappeared because she thought she was protecting them both. He pushed open the door. The room was dim, illuminated only by a small lamp casting warm shadows across the walls. Medical equipment hummed quietly. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine, her perfume, still clinging to the space around her. And there she was. Maya lay in the hospital bed, her long brown hair spread across the pillow, her skin pale with exhaustion, but still achingly beautiful. She looked like the same woman who had once turned his carefully ordered world into beautiful chaos. But it wasn't her that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the small figure curled up in the chair beside her bed. A little girl, impossibly tiny, sleeping peacefully with her head resting against Maya's arm. Han froze, his chest constricting with a sensation he didn't recognize at first. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even shock. It was something deeper, something primal, something that reached into the part of him he thought he'd killed years ago. Love. The little girl had dark curls, soft and wild, falling across her forehead. Her lashes were long and delicate, her cheeks round and flushed with sleep. She clutched a small white blanket in one tiny fist, her fingers curled around it protectively. She looked perfect. And she looked like him. Han took a step forward, then another, drawn to her as if every moment of his life had been leading him to this exact point. He stopped beside the bed, staring down at the child who had existed for 18 months without him knowing, without him protecting her. His daughter. His throat tightened. He didn't touch her. He didn't dare. His hands that had pulled triggers, signed death warrants, broken bones, suddenly felt unworthy of touching something so small, so innocent, so impossibly pure. Han. The voice was soft, weak, achingly familiar. If this story has you absolutely hooked on intense mafia romance and high-stakes drama, hit that like button right now to let me know you're ready for more. Share this video with anyone who craves these emotionally charged stories, and subscribe to the channel. Seriously, don't skip this one, because what happens next will leave you breathless. This is only the beginning of Han's war to protect his family, and you won't want to miss a single moment of what's coming. Maya's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with exhaustion. When they found him standing beside the bed, something flickered across her face: shock, relief, fear, all tangled together. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Han couldn't speak. Every calculated word he'd ever learned, every carefully constructed sentence, disappeared. He could only stare at her, at the woman who had haunted every empty moment of the last 18 months. "I didn't know if you would," she continued, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't know if. Why didn't you tell me?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, raw with emotions he didn't know how to name. Maya's gaze dropped to the sleeping child. "I couldn't. I thought if I disappeared, if I stayed away, she'd be safe from your world. From the enemies who would use her to destroy you. You thought I wouldn't protect you both?" The words tasted bitter. "I thought you'd sacrifice yourself for us," she said quietly. "And I couldn't live with that." The little girl stirred, a soft sound escaping her lips. Both of them froze, watching as her eyes slowly opened. They were dark, intelligent, observing the stranger standing over her with curiosity rather than fear. Han's chest constricted. She looked at him for a long moment, then tilted her head, studying his face with an intensity that reminded him of himself. "Mama," she whispered, still holding her mother's arm. "It's okay, sweetheart," Maya said softly, stroking her daughter's hair. This is someone very important." The little girl sat up slowly, her tiny fingers still clutching the white blanket. She looked between Maya and Han, processing something with a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so small. "Are you my daddy?" The question hit him like a blade between the ribs. Han dropped to one knee beside the chair, bringing himself to her eye level. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say, how to be, what this moment required of him. Yes, he finally managed, his voice breaking on the single word. She watched him carefully, then reached out one small hand and placed it on his cheek. Her palm was warm, impossibly soft against the sharp line of his jaw. "You have sad eyes," she said. "Like Mama." Something inside him cracked. The armor he'd spent years forging, the walls he'd built to survive in a world of blood and betrayal, fractured under the weight of her innocent touch. "What's your name?" he asked, his throat tight. "Ella," she said. "I'm 3.5. 3.5. She had existed for 3.5 years without him. 3.5 years of birthdays, first words, first steps, all the moments he could never get back. "Ella," he repeated, tasting her name like a prayer. "I'm sorry I wasn't there." She tilted her head again, considering this. Then she smiled, small and tentative. "You're here now." Those 4 words broke him completely. Han stayed on his knee, unable to move, unable to look away from the small hand still resting against his face. Ella watched him with those dark eyes, so much like his own, seeing far too much for a child her age. "You're scary," she said matter-of-factly. "But not to me." A sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sob. Maya's hand covered her mouth, tears streaming freely now. "No," Han whispered. "Never to you." Ella nodded, satisfied with this answer. She pulled her hand back and looked down at her stuffed rabbit, adjusting its worn ears with careful fingers. "Mama says bad people are looking for us. Are you going to stop them?" The question was so simple, so direct, so trusting. She didn't understand what she was asking. Didn't understand that the bad people she mentioned were monsters, killers, men who would use her as leverage to tear apart everything Han had built. But she didn't need to understand. She just needed to be protected. "Yes," he said, and it was a vow, an oath sealed in blood. "No one will touch you. No one will hurt you or your mother. I promise." "Okay," Ella said, as if his word was law, as if she'd already decided to trust him completely. She yawned, settling back against Maya's side. I'm sleepy again. Maya stroked her hair, her eyes meeting Han's over their daughter's head. The fear in her gaze was unmistakable. Han, they know about her. My brother, he found out somehow. He's working with Park Jin-woo, Han finished, his voice turning to ice. The name of his greatest rival, the man who'd been trying to dismantle his organization for years. Maya nodded, trembling. They've been watching us. Following us. That's why I collapsed. I haven't slept in days, always moving, always hiding. But they're getting closer and her voice broke. I didn't know where else to go. Han stood, his mind already calculating routes, safe houses, which of his men he could trust with this. The hospital wasn't secure. Too many exits, too many windows, too many ways for an enemy to slip through. We're leaving, he said. Now. But the doctor said. I don't care what the doctor said. He moved to the bed, careful not to jostle Ella. You're not safe here. Neither of you are. Maya's hand caught his wrist, her grip weak but desperate. Where will we go? My estate. The penthouse. He looked down at her, letting her see the absolute certainty in his eyes. It's a fortress. 24-hour security, bulletproof glass, armed guards at every entrance. No one gets in without my permission. No one. Your men, can you trust them? The question cut deep because she was right to ask it. In his world, loyalty was currency, and currency could always be bought by the highest bidder. But there were some he'd trust with his life. And now he'd trust them with something infinitely more valuable. The ones who matter, yes. He pulled out his phone, already dialing. Get dressed. We leave in 5 minutes. Maya nodded, moving carefully to gather her things. Han stepped into the hallway, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper when his second-in-command answered. Minjun, bring the car to the east entrance. Full security detail. And sweep the perimeter. If anyone's watching this hospital, I want them eliminated before we move. Understood, boss. What's happening? Han glanced back through the doorway at Ella, now sleeping peacefully in Maya's arms. Everything, he said. Everything just changed. The drive through Seoul's rain-slicked streets was tense and silent. Han sat in the back of the armored SUV, Maya pressed against his side with Ella sleeping in her arms. 2 vehicles flanked them, front and back, his most trusted men inside with weapons ready. Maya hadn't stopped trembling since they left the hospital. Her eyes darted to every passing car, every shadow that moved too quickly in the night. Han wanted to tell her it would be okay, that she was safe now, but he learned long ago that empty promises were worse than silence. Instead, he placed his hand over hers where it clutched Ella's blanket. Maya's fingers were ice cold. How long have they been hunting you? He asked quietly. 6 months, she whispered. Maybe longer. I didn't realize at first. I thought I was being paranoid. Her voice cracked. But then I found the tracker on my car. And the photos. Han's jaw tightened. Photos? Of Ella. At the park, at her daycare, getting ice cream. Maya's eyes filled with fresh tears. They've been watching her, Han. Cataloging her routines. Planning something. The rage that flooded through him was cold and surgical. Park Jin-woo had just signed his own death warrant. They won't get close to her again, Han said, and it wasn't a promise, it was fact. The SUV pulled through a private gate into an underground garage. Motion sensors triggered lights that illuminated rows of luxury vehicles and armed guards positioned at every corner. Maya's eyes widened as they exited the vehicle and headed toward a private elevator. Where are we? Home, Han said simply. The elevator rose silently to the top floor. When the doors opened, they stepped directly into Han's penthouse, 30 floors above the city, all steel and glass and carefully curated power. His staff stood waiting in the entrance as he'd instructed. They were professionals, trained to maintain composure in any situation. But when they saw their boss emerge from the elevator with a woman and child, Shock rippled through them like a current. No one spoke. No one dared. Minjun stepped forward, his face carefully neutral. Boss, the perimeter is secure. I've doubled the guard rotation and activated all surveillance systems. Good. Han's gaze swept over the assembled staff. This is Maya and Ella. They're under my protection. Anyone who speaks of their presence here, anyone who allows information to leak, anyone who fails in their duty, he let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but perfectly clear. They all nodded, understanding completely. Dismissed, Han said. Except you, Minjun. I want guards stationed outside my quarters. No one enters without my direct authorization. Your quarters, boss? Minjun's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion Han had seen from his second in almost a decade. Yes. Han turned to Maya, who stood frozen in the massive living space, looking small and lost despite the warmth of Ella in her arms. Come. He led them through the penthouse to the master suite, a space he designed with security as the primary concern. Reinforced walls, bulletproof windows, a panic room hidden behind the closet, and a secondary exit that led to a private stairwell. It was the safest room in the city. This is yours now, he said, watching Maya take in the space. Where will you sleep? She asked. Han looked at the woman he'd never stopped loving, at the daughter he'd just discovered, and felt something shift in his chest. Outside your door, he said. Where I can keep you both safe. Han sat with his back against the wall outside his master suite, a gun resting on his thigh and his eyes fixed on the elevator doors at the far end of the hallway. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, every shift in the building's ambient noise, every flicker of shadow made his hand move toward the weapon. Inside the room, he could hear nothing. Maya and Ella were finally resting, finally safe behind reinforced steel and bulletproof glass. But safe was relative in his world. Safe was temporary. Safe was an illusion men like him sold to themselves to justify the risks they took. The clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m. when Minjun emerged from the elevator, moving quickly but quietly down the hallway. His face was grim, and he carried something in his hand, a tablet. Han was on his feet before his second reached him. Talk, Han said, his voice low. Minjun glanced at the closed door behind Han, then handed him the tablet without a word. The screen showed security footage from the outer compound wall, time-stamped 20 minutes ago. Han's blood turned to ice. Spray-painted across the concrete in blood-red letters, 6 feet tall and impossible to miss. We know about her. When? Han's voice was deadly calm, the kind of calm that preceded violence. Security caught it during the 3:30 perimeter sweep. Whoever did it was fast, in and out in under 4 minutes, before the cameras cycled back to that sector. For minutes. Han's jaw clenched. Someone timed it. Someone knows our rotation schedule. Minjun nodded grimly. That's not all, boss. They left something. He swiped to another image on the tablet. It was a photograph, pinned beneath the painted message with a knife. A photograph of Ella at the hospital, sleeping in Maya's arms, taken through the window of room 407. Han's hand tightened around the tablet until the glass cracked. They were watching the hospital, he said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. They knew we'd go there. They probably followed us back. It's possible. Minjun's expression was stone. But our men swept for tails. We would have seen. They didn't follow the vehicles, Han interrupted, his mind working through the possibilities with brutal efficiency. They tracked us electronically. Or they already knew we'd bring them here. He looked at his second. We have a leak. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Do you want me to start interrogations? Minjun asked. Not yet. If there's a traitor, I don't want them to know we're looking. Han handed back the tablet. Triple the guard rotation. I want eyes on every entrance, every window, every ventilation shaft. Activate the motion sensors on the roof. And get me a list of everyone who's had access to this building in the last 48 hours, staff, security, contractors, everyone. Understood. And Minjun. Han's eyes were cold, empty of everything except lethal purpose. Tear down that wall and burn it. I don't want her to see that message if she looks out the window. His second nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Boss, if they're this close. I know, Han said quietly. They're not just close. They're inside our perimeter. Which means they're planning something soon. What do we do? Han looked back at the door behind him, thinking of the woman and child sleeping on the other side. Thinking of how close he'd come to never knowing they existed. Thinking of what he'd do to anyone who tried to take them from him now. We prepare for war, he said. Because war is coming whether we're ready or not. Dawn broke over Seoul, pale light filtering through the bulletproof windows. Han heard movement inside the suite, soft footsteps, water running, the quiet murmur of Maya's voice as she spoke to Ella. He'd been awake for 31 hours straight, his body running on adrenaline and coffee, but he wouldn't leave his post. Not now. The door opened. Maya stood there, still pale but steadier than last night. She'd changed into clothes his staff had brought, simple jeans and a sweater that made her look impossibly young and vulnerable. You didn't sleep, she said. It wasn't a question. Neither did you. She stepped into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind her. Ella's watching cartoons. We should talk before she hears this. Han straightened, recognizing the weight in her voice. Tell me. Maya wrapped her arms around herself, unable to meet his eyes. My brother, Daniel. He's the one working with Park Jin-woo. He's the one who found us. Han had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent fresh rage coursing through his veins. Why? Money. Power. The things men like him always want. Her voice cracked. He found out about us somehow, about Ella. He saw an opportunity. Park Jin-woo offered him territory, protection, a seat at the table, in exchange for, she couldn't finish. In exchange for Ella, Han finished, his voice like frozen steel. Maya nodded, tears streaming down her face. He wants to sell her to the highest bidder, Han. Use her as leverage against you, or worse, she covered her mouth, choking on the words. He's my brother. My own blood. And he's willing to trade his niece like she's property. The rage that flooded Han was absolute, volcanic, the kind that had built empires and burned them to ash. His hand moved his gun instinctively, ready to end this threat with brutal efficiency. I'll kill him, he said simply. Tonight. No. Maya grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. You can't just charge in blind. That's what he wants. That's what they're counting on for you to react with violence instead of strategy. He threatened our daughter. And he knows you, Han. Her eyes blazed with desperate intensity. He knows you'll come for him with everything you have. He's prepared for that. He's counting on it. If you go in reckless, you'll walk into a trap. Han wanted to argue, wanted to tear through the city until he found Daniel Chin and made him pay for every sleepless night Maya had endured, every moment of fear Ella had lived through. But Maya was right. Emotion made men stupid. And stupid men died. There's more, Maya whispered. Daniel knew we were at the hospital. He knew we'd come here. He knew which room we were in, which vehicle we'd use. She looked up at him, fear and certainty warring in her expression. Someone in your organization is feeding him information. The words confirmed what Han already suspected, but hearing them spoken aloud made them real, immediate, dangerous. Who? He asked. I don't know. But Daniel bragged about it the last time he found us. Said he had eyes inside your operation. Said there was nowhere we could hide that he wouldn't know about. Han's mind raced through possibilities, through faces and names and moments that might have been suspicious, but weren't questioned. Trust was the foundation of his empire, but trust could be bought, manipulated, broken. Then we root them out, he said. All of them. Maya's hand tightened on his arm. And then, Han looked at her, letting her see the cold promise in his eyes. Then I show your brother what happens to men who threaten my family. Han spent the next 12 hours methodically dissecting his own organization. He started with the security detail, the men who'd driven them from the hospital, the guards positioned at the penthouse, anyone who'd had access to their movements or location. He didn't announce what he was doing, didn't raise alarms or make threats. He simply called them in one by one, casual conversations in his office that felt routine until they weren't. Minjun stood beside him, silent and watchful, as Han questioned each man about their assignments, their finances, their families. Most were clean, loyal soldiers who'd proven themselves over years of service. But Han had learned long ago that everyone had a price. It was just a matter of finding what that price was. The seventh man was named Kim Sung-ho. 20 years old, 3 years with the organization, decent record, no red flags. He sat across from Han's desk with the easy confidence of someone who thought he was untouchable. "You were on perimeter duty the night we brought Maya and Ella here," Han said, his tone conversational. "Yes, boss. East sector rotation. And you swept for electronic surveillance?" "Standard protocol." "Found nothing." Han leaned back in his chair, studying the man with the patience of a hunter. "Your mother's medical bills were paid off last week. Unusual for someone on your salary." The confidence flickered. Just for a second, but it was enough. "I've been saving." 300,000 won, Han interrupted. "Paid in full to Samsung Medical Center." "That's more than you make in a year, Sung-ho." The silence stretched. Sung-ho's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white. "I want to give you a chance to explain," Han said quietly. "Because if you don't, I'll assume the worst. And you know what I do to traitors." Sung-ho's face crumbled. "They said they'd kill her. My mother. They showed me photos of her room, her nurses, the exact times she was alone. I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice." Han's voice was ice. "You chose money over loyalty. You chose their threats over my protection. You chose to put my daughter in danger." "I didn't know about the child, I swear." "What did you tell them?" Sung-ho's breath came in ragged gasps. "Everything. The hospital, the route we'd take, the security protocols, the penthouse layout. They wanted to know where you'd put them, which room, how many guards." Tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry, boss." "I'm so sorry." Han stood, walking around the desk with deliberate slowness. "Who did you report to?" "A man named Chin. Daniel Chin. He paid me through an offshore account. Maya's brother." The confirmation settled like lead in Han's stomach. "Minjun," Han said calmly. "Take him to the basement." Sung-ho lunged from his chair, desperate. "Please, boss, my mother will receive a pension for the rest of her life," Han said. "Because unlike you, I honor my commitments. But you betrayed your brothers. You endangered an innocent child. There's no mercy for that." Minjun dragged the sobbing man from the office. The door closed with a soft click. Han stood alone in the silence, staring out at the Seoul skyline. For years, he'd built his power by reacting to threats, by defending his territory, by surviving. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Not when Ella's life hung in the balance. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Boss?" Minjun answered. "Change of plans," Han said, his voice cold and certain. "We're done defending. Get me everything we have on Daniel Chin and Park Jin-woo's operation. Every location, every asset, every weakness." "You're going after them?" "I'm going to burn them to the ground." The tracker was discovered at 6:47 p.m., magnetically attached to the undercarriage of the SUV they'd used to transport Maya and Ella from the hospital. Minjun brought it to Han's office in a sealed evidence bag, his face grim. "GPS-enabled, real-time location feed," Minjun said. "Military grade. They've been watching our every move." Han held the small device up to the light, turning it over in his fingers. It was sophisticated, expensive, the kind of equipment that required connections and resources. Park Jin-woo's signature was all over it. "They know we found the traitor," Han said. "Which means they know their inside source is gone. So they'll have to move soon. Tonight, probably." "Not probably." Han set the tracker on his desk with careful precision. "Definitely. They've been patient this long because they had eyes inside our walls. Now they're blind, and blind men make desperate moves. Minjun nodded slowly, understanding dawning. You want them to come. I want them to think they have the advantage. Han's smile was cold, predatory. We know they're coming. They don't know we know. That makes this our game, not theirs. He moved to the wall screen and pulled up a tactical map of the penthouse grounds, the courtyard, the vehicle entrance, the perimeter walls, every angle and sightline mapped in precise detail. Here's what we do, Han said, his finger tracing paths across the screen. Pull back the visible security. Make it look like we're vulnerable, like we're scrambling after losing our mole. But position sharpshooters on the roof, heavy weapons teams in the garage, and a kill squad in the east wing. When they enter the courtyard, we close the exits and turn this place into a tomb. Minjun studied the map, his expression thoughtful. They'll bring numbers. Park Jin-woo won't risk a small team, not for something this valuable. Good. Let him bring everyone. I want to send a message that echoes through every syndicate in Asia. Han's eyes were empty of everything except lethal purpose. No one touches my family and lives. I'll brief the teams, Minjun said, turning to leave. And Minjun? No prisoners. No mercy. When this is over, I want Daniel Chin and Park Jin-woo dead, and I want their organizations to know exactly what happens when they come after mine. After his second left, Han stood alone in his office for a long moment, staring at the tactical map. The plan was sound. His men were loyal, trained, prepared for exactly this kind of engagement. The odds were in his favor. But war always carried risks. And tonight, the stakes were higher than any battle he'd ever fought. He found Maya in the master suite, sitting on the floor with Ella, building a tower out of blocks. The scene was so domestic, so achingly normal, that it felt like something from someone else's life. Ella looked up when he entered. Look, Daddy. I made it taller than Mama. The words still hit him like a fist to the chest every time she said it. It's beautiful, he said, kneeling beside them. Maya met his eyes, and he saw that she understood. She'd lived in this world long enough to recognize the signs, the tension in his shoulders, the controlled calm in his voice, the way he looked at Ella like he was memorizing her face. When, she asked quietly, "Tonight." She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "Come back to us." Han raised her hand to his lips, a gesture he'd never allowed himself before, too tender for a man with blood on his hands. "I promise," he said. It was the first promise he'd ever made that terrified him. They came at midnight, exactly as Han predicted. 3 black vans rolled through the compound gates that had been deliberately left open, their headlights cutting through the manufactured darkness. Han watched from the shadows of the east wing, Minjun beside him, both men armed and silent as ghosts. The van stopped in the center of the courtyard. Doors opened, and men poured out, 20 soldiers, maybe more, all armed with automatic weapons. They fanned out with military precision, covering angles and exits with the confidence of men who thought they held the advantage. Then Park Jin-woo emerged from the center vehicle, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit, his face weathered by decades of violence. Beside him came Daniel Chin, younger, arrogant, his eyes scanning the building with predatory satisfaction. "Han Jaemin." Park's voice echoed across the courtyard. "We know you're here. We know the woman and child are inside. Send them out, and we'll make this quick. Resist, and we'll burn this entire building to ash." Han remained motionless, watching, waiting. Daniel stepped forward, emboldened by the silence. "Maya, stop hiding behind a killer and bring my niece out here. This doesn't have to end badly for you." The casual way he said it, my niece, as if Ella were property, as if she were something to be traded and sold, ignited something dark and absolute in Han's chest. He raised his hand. The signal. The courtyard exploded. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly stars. Park's men scattered, returning fire blindly, but they were exposed, caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The kill teams in the garage opened up from ground level, creating a devastating crossfire that cut through the enemy formation like a scythe through wheat. Screams. Chaos. The acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Han moved. He descended the stairs into the courtyard, Minjun and his personal guard flanking him, their weapons raised. The remaining enemy soldiers turned toward them, desperate, realizing too late that they'd walked into a slaughter. Park Jin-woo stood behind an overturned van, his suit splattered with blood, not his own. His eyes widened when he saw Han approaching through the carnage, calm and inevitable as death itself. "You bastard," Park snarled, raising his weapon. Han was faster. His shot took Park in the shoulder, spinning him around. The gun clattered from his hand. "That's for threatening my daughter," Han said quietly. Daniel Chin tried to run. He made it 3 steps before Han's boot caught him in the back, sending him sprawling onto the blood-slicked concrete. Han was on him in seconds, grabbing him by the collar and dragging him upright. "Please," Daniel gasped, his arrogance shattered, replaced by raw terror. "I can give you information, names, locations." "You traded your niece for money," Han said, his voice empty of emotion. "You hunted her mother for months. You brought war to my doorstep. I was just following orders." Han's fist connected with Daniel's jaw, a brutal crack that sent teeth flying. Daniel collapsed, choking on blood. Behind them, Park Jin-woo struggled to his feet, reaching for a backup weapon. Han turned, drew his pistol with practiced ease, and fired once. The shot echoed across the courtyard. Park's body crumpled. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in Han's ears and the labored breathing of the few enemy soldiers still alive, all of them on their knees, surrounded by his men. Han looked down at Daniel, broken and bleeding at his feet. "Tell me why I shouldn't kill you right now." Daniel sobbed, his words barely coherent. "I'm Maya's brother." "She wouldn't want." "Maya wanted her daughter safe," Han interrupted. "You made that impossible." He raised his weapon. "This is mercy," he said, and pulled the trigger. The courtyard fell silent once more. Han stood among the bodies, covered in evidence of his victory, and felt nothing except the cold certainty of what he'd done. It was over. Finally over. Han climbed the stairs to the master suite, each step heavier than the last. His suit was ruined, splattered with blood that wasn't his. His knuckles were split, his shoulder ached from the recoil of his weapon, and his ears still rang with the echo of gunfire. But he was alive. And more importantly, they were safe. Minjun had stayed behind to coordinate cleanup, the bodies, the vehicles, the evidence that needed to disappear before dawn. The remaining soldiers were being processed, the perimeter secured, the compound locked down tighter than a vault. It would take days to fully restore order. But the immediate threat was eliminated. Park Jin-woo was dead. Daniel Chin was dead. And anyone else who'd considered coming after his family had just received a very clear message about what that choice would cost them. Han stopped outside the master suite door, his hand on the handle. He could hear movement inside, Maya's voice, soft and soothing, Ella's higher-pitched response. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Sounds he'd just killed 20 men to protect. He pushed open the door. Maya stood by the window, holding Ella in her arms. She turned at the sound, her eyes widening when she saw him bloodied, exhausted, but whole. "It's over," he said simply. Maya's breath caught. She set Ella down carefully, then crossed the room in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around him, not caring about the blood, not caring about anything except that he'd kept his promise. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "I always will." Ella watched them from across the room, her dark eyes so much like his, studying her father with that unsettling wisdom she possessed. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, her small face serious. Han pulled back from Maya and knelt down, bringing himself to Ella's eye level. He didn't try to hide what he was. didn't try to pretend his hands weren't stained with violence. "Are you hurt?" Ella asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart. I'm okay." She took a tentative step toward him, then another, until she stood directly in front of him. Her small hand reached out and touched his cheek, just as she had in the hospital. "You look scary," she said. "I know, but you protected us." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of a child who'd decided to trust him completely. "Yes," Han said, his voice breaking on the word. "I'll always protect you. Both of you. No matter what." Ella seemed to consider this, then nodded solemnly. She dropped her rabbit and wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. Han froze, terrified he'd somehow hurt her, that the blood on his clothes would contaminate her innocence. But she just held on tighter, her tiny body trembling. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. The words shattered him. Every wall he'd ever built, every defense mechanism he'd constructed to survive in a world of violence and betrayal, crumbled under the weight of those 4 words from a 3.5-year-old who'd known him for less than 48 hours. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was made of glass and starlight, like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because she was. "I love you too," he whispered back, the words foreign but absolutely true. "Forever, Ella. Forever." Maya knelt beside them, her hand on his shoulder, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in his brutal life, Han Jaemin felt something he'd never allowed himself to feel. Peace. The war was over. His family was safe. And he was no longer just a mafia boss who'd spent years surviving in darkness. He was a father. And nothing would ever be the same. If you're feeling the weight of this emotional ending, show some love by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a dose of intense romance and redemption, and subscribe. Don't just watch and leave, subscribe so you're here when the next chapter drops. Because Han's story isn't over. His enemies may be dead, but building a life in the light when you've lived in shadows? That's a whole different kind of war.